Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are joining us from. Welcome to our today's webinar, FSSC 22000 version 7, key updates, new PRPs, and audit readiness. My name is Titi Susanti. I'm Global Director for Consumer, Retail, and Food Sector at PSI, and I'll be your host and moderator for this session. So today's discussion will focus on key changes in FSSC 22000 version 7, new prerequisite program across all sectors, including practical examples of how we meet the new requirements, as well as strategies to prepare for successful audit. All right, before we start, let's go for some housekeeping first. All lines will be muted during the webinar, and please submit your questions in the Q&A chat box. The webinar will be recorded, and then we'll distribute the recording and slides to all attendees after the webinar. And then at the end of the webinar, we will need your help to complete the feedback survey before you leave. All right, so today we have two speakers, Kelly Mulholland. She's a technical manager, safety and quality at Foundation FSSC. Kelly oversees the FSSC 22000 scheme and the FSSC 22000 development program. She has an extensive background in food safety after working as a technical and compliance manager for food for a global certification body. And then the second speaker, we have Leanne Singleton, food safety specialist at FoodSure. Leanne is a food safety consultant, auditor, trainer, and technical contributor to standards and learning content with more than 20 years of experience across the food supply network. Leanne is also the technical author for the revised PAS 96 2026 Food Defense Guide, and she has a special interest in food waste reduction. All right, before we start, we have actually a polling question. So please help to answer this polling question. So we'd like to know, what is your biggest concern regarding the FSSC 22000 version 7 transition? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 options. So please help to fill out these polling questions. We'll give maybe 1 minute, or we'll see if we hit maybe 50%, then we can start to show the result. All right, so can everyone see the, okay, so, all right, I think from more than 59% of the respondents thinks that understanding the new PRP requirements is their biggest concern. So I guess you guys are coming to the right webinar now, because we are going to discuss that here. All right, so let's start our webinar now. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Kelly. Over to you.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting myself and FSSC to be part of the webinar today. Really, really great to be here. So as mentioned, I will be focusing on the main changes in the newly released version 7 of the scheme. So we can go to the next slide, please. And I will start with an introduction to FSSC 22000. I'll then go through the reasons and explain the reasons behind version 7 and why the change occurred. I'll then have a look at the main changes in part 2, and I'll touch on a portion of the upgrade process. But let's start with a brief introduction to FSSC 22000. So why choose FSSC 22000 certification? So FSSC 22000 provides a framework for a robust and an effective food safety management system, with the emphasis on management systems. And that's because we utilize the existing ISO standards, so that includes ISO 22000 and the applicable ISO PRP standards for the different sectors. So one of the benefits of this is that it aligns to the harmonized structure of ISO, which then also facilitates integrated management system audits, as well as for the implementation of an integrated management system within an organization. It's also a science-based standard that was developed by international experts, and therefore we believe also reliable. And also on that note, FSSC also sits as a liaison on the working groups for standard developments for ISO 22000, as well as for the newly released ISO 22002 series for PRPs. The scheme is also GFSI recognized and has been for a long time, and this also then contributes to the global acceptance of the scheme. Our application for GFSI benchmarking for version 7 of the scheme has been submitted. It is in progress, and we do aim to have that GFSI recognition in place for version 7 prior to version 7 audit upgrade audits commencing. So hopefully by April of next year. Then as part of our governance structure and our assurance activities, we've developed a robust integrity program, and that is to ensure that our certification bodies like BSI deliver reliable audits and certification in accordance with the scheme requirements and the normative standards. And then the scope of FSSC 22000 covers multiple sectors across the food supply chain as well. Then if we go on to the next slide, you will see that it provides an overview of the FSSC 22000 scheme. And we're pleased to say that we currently have more than 40,000 FSSC 22000 certified organizations around the world. And whilst that's not the focus of the scheme, it does go towards showing the acceptance of the scheme in the markets, as well as the trust that people place within our certification. And in order to deliver the scheme, we partner with more than 170 certification bodies and accreditation bodies, such as BSI, and we're supported by our internal FSSC team, as well as our stakeholders. We also work closely with international bodies such as ISO, GFSI, Global ACI, which is the previous IAF, as well as UNIDO and WPO. And we also have an advisory committee and a board of stakeholders. Then at the bottom of the slide, you can also see the multiple sectors that the scheme covers. And this is from animal feed and animal food production all the way through to retail and wholesale. And then as some of you might know or be aware of, we also have something called if we could go back to the previous slide, please. We have something called the development program. And this was designed for small to medium-sized enterprises and those organizations who are not yet ready for a full third-party certification. So to this end, to support the development program, we've also published a set of guidance documents. And this is a set of guidance documents for the 5 different sectors that we allow for assessments against for the development program. And it's been developed to help industry with the implementation and the application of the program. So if you haven't already looked at these guidance documents, please do. They are freely available for download on our website, and they do contain a wealth of information. Then on the next slide, you will see that we're having a look at the overview of the structure of the FSSC 22000 scheme. So the normative documents related to the scheme is ISO 22000-2018 for the food safety management system requirements, then the sector-specific PRP standards and the FSSC 22000 additional requirements, which is found in Part 2 of the scheme document. Organizations also need to remember to refer to the Board of Stakeholders decision list, or our BOS list for short, and our scheme interpretation articles, as these are also mandatory documents, so they need to be applied. And then in relation to version 7, the PRP requirements have changed, as I'm sure you are aware when we looked at that poll question. So these PRP standards have changed from the ISO technical specification to the new ISO 22002 series of standards that was published in 2025. And the changes have also been made to the FSSC additional requirements. So I'll have a look at the main changes in Part 2 of the scheme documents, and Leanne will be covering those PRPs as well, which we know you're all excited to have a look at. So then if we go on now, on the next slide, we will start to have a look at version 7 and why it was changed. So the main drivers for the change includes incorporating these new PRP standards, then alignment of the scheme with the GFSI benchmarking requirements of 2024. We've also strengthened requirements to help organizations meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and we'll have a look at 2 of these updates that were made later on during my presentation. And then we also provided a defined structure for the division of food chain subcategories, And at the same time, we also took the opportunity to make editorial changes and amendments to the scheme as part of our continuous improvement process. But next, let us start with the main changes in version 7. And in today's session, I will mostly focus on part 2 of the scheme, which addresses the requirements for organizations to be audited. However, for a full overview of the main changes in the scheme, please do refer to our main changes documents. They're published on our website under the Scheme Documents tab, and you just need to refer to the section titled Additional Information. And within these main changes versions, you will see all the additions have been highlighted in red. So then part 2 of the scheme describes the scheme requirements against which licensed certification bodies will audit the food safety management system of your organization, either to achieve or to maintain certification. And this section defines that organizations, like I've mentioned, are audited against ISO 22000, the PRP set of standards, and the FSSC 22000 additional requirements, along with any of those box decision scheme interpretation articles. And within version 7, as we've already mentioned, the new PRP requirements have been included. And another clarification was also made within the section that any amendments to ISO 22000 that's made by ISO is also covered by the scheme and therefore auditable, such as the climate change amendment that took place in previous years. But now let us move on to the next slide to discuss the changes FSSC has made to the additional requirements. So firstly, we've incorporated the version 6 box decision number 4 from March 2024. And this includes updating the requirement on laboratory analysis used for verification and or validation of parameters critical to food safety, which included that the analysis shall be performed in accordance with the applicable requirements of ISO IEC 17025. And also good to highlight that FSSC already published a scheme interpretation article in June 2024, which provided further clarification on laboratory analysis requirements and the implementation thereof. So if you're not familiar with the scheme interpretation article as of yet, or the one that we published on quality control, we do highly recommend that you download them from our website. As I mentioned before, scheme interpretation articles are mandatory, and these two already with version 6. So then on the next slide, we start to have a look at the updates to the additional requirements linked to the GFSI benchmarking requirements of 2024. So let's start off with the update made to the specification requirement included under 251. So here, organizations need to ensure that microbiological, physical, chemical, and allergenic specifications that are used for food safety purposes are based on appropriate scientific principles, and this is when relevant legislation is absent. And this could be things such as, for those scientific principles, it could be things such as scientific results or international standards, for example. And then on the next slide, also based on the GFSI benchmarking requirement updates, we've updated the requirements of food defense and food fraud mitigation. And this is to ensure that the assessments and the plans, so the threat assessments, vulnerability assessments, and the food fraud mitigation and food defense plans are developed and maintained by personnel who have the appropriate knowledge and competence to undertake them. And that's knowledge relevant to food defense and food fraud, undertaking assessments, developing of plans, the implementing of mitigation measures, as well as knowledge of the process and the products that the organization is undertaking in order to develop effective plans. And then with regards to food safety and quality culture on the next slide, you will see that we updated it and we updated the requirement to indicate that senior management shall provide sufficient resources to maintain a positive food safety and quality culture, as well as that a demonstrable commitment from all personnel to the production and safe handling of food shall be available, as all personnel need to be committed to the production and safe handling of food. Now then, when we move on to other updates to make to the additional requirements unrelated to the benchmarking requirements, you will see that we've reduced the food defense and food fraud mitigation requirements within the additional requirements. However, they're not gone. This is just due to them having been included within the new ISO 22002 Part 100 PRP standard. So the requirements in the scheme overall for food defense and food fraud has not been reduced. It's just in which normative document you need to look in to see where those requirements are present. So that's within the Part 100 standard now. And then we also made updates to the clause references throughout the additional requirements to align with the new PRP series. So please do make sure to check those new references out as well. Then on to the next slide, you will see that we made some specific updates with regards to stakeholder feedback that we receive, as well as for continuous improvement of the scheme and global food safety. So with regards to artwork management and print control requirements, this now applies to all organizations that print labels and/or materials, and no longer only applies to Category I organizations, as many food and feed manufacturers also print their own materials in-house, and therefore they also need to have control over these processes. Then with regards to allergen management, we've updated the requirement 256H, and this is we've updated it to indicate that it also applies to pet food producers now as well, and not only to animal feed producers. So now it indicates that where there is no allergen-related legislation for the country of sale pertaining to the animal feed or pet food, then this section of the scheme requirements, and this is the requirements for allergen management, may be indicated as not applicable. And this is unless a claim relating to an allergen status has been made on the animal food or pet food. For example, allergenicity claims such as hyperallergenic, in which case the requirements would then apply if a claim was made. Then on to the next slide, with regards to the PRP verification additional requirement, which relates to the organization needing to establish, implement, and maintain routine site inspections and PRP checks, you will see that this requirement now also applies to catering and food service industry, as well as to the retail and the wholesale sector. So overall, this requirement now only does not apply to food chain category F2 for trading and brokering, as the sector undertakes administration activities only. So all other food chain categories are now required for this requirement, except for food chain category F2. And then regarding product design and development, with regards to this additional requirement linked to shelf life validation and ongoing verification, we've clarified that it applies to food chain categories B3, C, D, and K. And this is the requirement that indicates the need to conduct production and shelf life trials to validate product formulation and processes are capable of producing safe products, and also that they meet customer requirements. And then also that there needs to be a process for ongoing shelf life verification in place at a frequency that is based on risk. Then next, onto the next slide, we're looking at additional requirement 2514. So previously in version 6, this requirement was about the health status of personnel linked to food chain category D, so animal feed production. However, this has been removed as this requirement is now sufficiently addressed within Part 100. So again, the requirement is still covered within the scheme, it's just under a different normative document. And then with regards to version 6, BOSS decision number 3 for March 2024, this has now been added into version 7 as the new additional requirement 2514. And this relates to the organization, and that is a category C0 organization for animal primary conversion, needing to establish, implement, and maintain appropriate procedures and systems to ensure the traceability of all edible parts of the carcass is maintained until the carcass has been deemed fit for human consumption. And a reminder that this was added into the version 6 BOSS decision list to meet a GFSI benchmarking requirement. And then regarding the additional requirement on food loss and waste, that's additional requirement 2516. Here we've also clarified that food loss and waste objectives need to be supported by clear and measurable targets with defined timelines. And this is to further support the reduction of food loss and waste, as well as to continue the contribution towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. And then on the next slide, with regards to the additional requirements for organizations with multi-site certification, we've updated it to indicate that it now also applies to food chain category B3, and this is for pre-process handling of plant products, for example, for pack houses. And this is when a B3 organization is undergoing multi-site certification, as this food chain category is now also able to undergo multi-site certification from version 7 onwards. And then on the next slide, we're very pleased to announce that we've incorporated a new requirement under product design and development. And this requirement applies to all organizations that design primary packaging and packaging material. And the main aim of this requirement is to further support food loss and waste reduction. So the requirement was developed with the support of WPO, the World Packaging Organization, for which FSSC is an associate member, and AIP, the Australasian Institute of Packaging. And it's based on the AIP Safe Food Packaging Design criteria and the principles within, and these were globalized by WPO. So let's look at this requirement in more detail. So organizations that design primary packaging or packaging material, so not only category I organizations, but all organizations that design primary packaging or that design primary packaging material need to take the following principles into consideration. And this is when they're developing new products or making changes to packaging material. And these principles include the effective containment and protection of the product from spoilage and damage throughout all steps in the supply chain, and to preserve and extend the shelf life of the product being packed, to minimize food loss and waste, as well as clear communication to consumers on how to handle, store, and prepare food. And then where any of the above-mentioned principles are incorporated, it shall not negatively impact on food safety. And again, this requirement is requiring organizations to consider these principles within the design, and that they need to be able to demonstrate they've considered it. However, it's not required to implement all the principles where it is not viable, keeping in mind that requirements from other parts of the scheme that also connect with certain of these principles, such as within the PRP standard, such as on the communication of handling, storage, and preparation of food, is still mandatory to implement. And the intent of this requirement overall is for organizations to consider how can they design their packaging to reduce food loss and waste whilst not compromising on food safety. And for guidance on how to implement this requirement, once you've been sent these slides after the webinar, you can click on the link at the bottom of this slide where you can refer to the AIP Safe Food Packaging Design Criteria guidelines. Also on the next slide, you can see that there is a QR code, and you can scan this QR code now, and then it will take you to access these guidelines. As mentioned on the previous slide, the new requirement 2513G is based on the Safe Food Packaging Design Criteria guidelines. They were developed by AIP in conjunction with RMIT University and End Food Waste Australia, and again has been globalized by WPO. But a reminder that our scheme requirement only covers certain aspects of these principles and not all of them, so please do keep this in mind when reviewing the guidelines. But now let's look at the upgrade process from version 6 to version 7 on the next slide. And when we have a look at the slide that's currently displayed, it gives you an overview from the development of version 7 to when version 7 audits will commence. As you are aware, version 7 of the scheme was published on the 1st of May 2026. It also included a main changes version, and there's a 12-month transition window to allow for organizations as well as for certification bodies to prepare for the new version. Then on the next slide, we continue to look at the upgrade process, and the upgrade process document that is published and available freely for download on our website outlines the requirements for the transition process, and it includes timelines for the upgrade process, as well as the requirements for certification bodies and accreditation bodies to adhere to. And this is linked to topics such as communication, competency of auditors and personnel of the certification body, audits including audit duration, contract certificates, as well as licensing and accreditation of the certification body. So the upgrade process for version 7 is very similar to the upgrade process for version 6, including the 12-month transition window, and audits against version 6 are only allowed to be delivered up until the 30th of April 2027, and upgrade audits against version 7 need to be conducted from the 1st of May 2027 until the 30th of April 2028. And it's important to note and remember that it is both the CB and the certified organization's responsibility to ensure that the organization undergoes the upgrade audit within the required timeframes. So the audit duration calculations for all certified organizations need to be reviewed in line with the new audit duration calculation. And the CB will either need to issue a new contract to version 7 or version 7 addendum to the existing contract for the organization, taking into account the audit duration as per version 7. And then when we have a look at the audit duration, the audit duration for the version 7 upgrade audits will apply from the 1st of May 2027. And if the organization, for example, is undergoing the upgrade audit during a surveillance audit, the CB will need to calculate the surveillance audit duration as per the new version 7 requirements. So there is no additional increase in audit duration for the upgrade audit that is specified by FSSC. However, the CB can define an increase where deemed necessary based on the complexity and the scope of the organization, or in order to ensure that the audit objectives are met. And then when we look at the next slide, it's also good to note that FSSC has representatives in our market development department based around the world in many different regions. So please make use of the opportunity to reach out to any of them, depending on your region, if you need any further support from FSSC directly. And then that concludes my portion of today's webinar, and I will hand back over to BSI. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. We will now launch poll 2. And look, I can see your questions coming into the question box. I'm going to answer them in the next session. Thank you. Okay, so which area do you expect will require the most effort during your transition to FSSC 22000 version 7? So now that you've heard Kelly's excellent overview of what those changes are, we'd like a little bit of insight as to where you see where your efforts are going to be spent. So please submit your comments and we'll wrap up the poll in the next minute. Okay, and what are those results that we have coming through on the poll? Okay, it's balanced, but it looks like updating your prerequisite programs to ISO 22000 and the sector-specific standards is certainly where most people see their effort. And you know what? I think you're probably right, because that's what I'm just about to start talking about now. Equal interest in the other two areas around additional requirements. So look, without further ado, let's get into what the new prerequisite program requirements are. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So the most important thing with the prerequisite programs is we've got an entirely new structure. We've moved to a modular structure. So instead of having individual prerequisite programs for each different food sector, we now have common requirements that sit across all of the sectors. And then on top of that, you then need to add your own additional sector requirements. So the benefit of doing this is that we have harmonization of prerequisite programs across food, feed, and packaging supply chain, where those basic hygiene and housekeeping programs are the same across all of those different types of food sectors. And then there are specific individual requirements that hone into additional things that you would need to do as a manufacturer or as a caterer, etc. And I'm going to show you where those additional requirements sit above and beyond the common requirements. Next slide. So looking at those common requirements, what do we have? Well, in a very similar layout to the previous ISO 22002 prerequisite programs, you can see that we start at clause 4, looking at construction and layout of buildings, all the way through to clause 16. So there's been a little bit of movement around different clauses. You will recognise that pest control is in a different clause number to what it was before, but it's still there. So the emissions from the general requirements across common prerequisite programs are that rework has been removed because it's only included in the relevant food sector specific PRPs. It's not applicable to everybody. And in addition, if you'd previously worked with the food manufacturing prerequisite program, you will notice that the requirement for product recall, which is no longer specified, as this is considered to be covered under ISO 22000. So let's have a look at what the notable changes are to this prerequisite program that sets the common or the core requirements across all food sectors. Next slide. So the notable additions are that it has a stronger emphasis on risk-based approaches with controls that are proportionate to the contamination risks. And I was monitoring the chat box with a question and answer box before, and I saw that somebody said, what is the benefit of version 7 in comparison to other standards that are more prescriptive like BRC, GS and SQF? And I think the benefit of FSSC has always been that you determine and identify where your risks are, and you put in proportionate controls to manage those risks. Nobody's telling you what your risks are and how you are to address them. You have the freedom to do that within your food safety management system. So Under ISO 22002-100, generic requirements or common requirements for all sectors, there is updated terminology specifically around the inclusion of food loss and waste, which you will receive referred to as FLW, as there are common requirements for the storage of food loss and waste to make sure that you protect it from contamination. There's also updated terminology that has been applied to different hazards, and we'll go through those when we look at the different sector requirements. There's consideration of internal and external sources of environmental contamination. There's new drainage requirements. There's also requirements for adequate space to prevent contamination and for the protection of equipment from contamination. There is a stronger emphasis on specifications and monitoring for utilities, specifically water, ice and steam, and there's actions that are now required to be taken during active pest infestations. Some of the key changes are around waste management, which has now been expanded to include waste, food loss and waste, reuse and recycling. So materials that are identified as food loss and waste need to have designated storage, which is going to be suitable to maintain their next intended use. So if you intend to donate food for human consumption, you need to make sure that it's stored in a way that maintains the safety of that food for donation. If you're going to repurpose it to animal feed, you need to make sure that it's also protected from contamination. If it's going to be upcycled into another product, it also looks at suitability of storage so that it's not going to compromise pest control programs. Another requirement that has been added into the waste section is the disposal of labelled materials, products and printed packaging to make sure that there's no unauthorised use of these materials. And if you're going to hold materials for recycling or you're going to reuse materials, there's requirements around making sure that you store those products suitably so they don't compromise cleaning and other hygiene programs. A really good benefit in addition to the new ISO 22002 Part 100 is 2 new annexes. So Annex A details a list of food defence measures that you could consider implementing in your organisation, and Annex B looks at an example of food fraud mitigation measures. So as Kelly mentioned, some of the food fraud and food defence requirements have been removed from the FSSC additional requirements because there is a stronger emphasis of these in ISO 22002 Part 100. Next slide. So what does this mean for your organisation? So if you have joined the webinar today and you are a food manufacturer, you will need to have ISO 22002 Part 100, which are requirements for food, feed and packaging supply chain. You will then need to add in your food sector PRP program. So for food manufacturing, that is ISO 22002 Part 1. If you also, in addition to food manufacturing, in your scope of certification have transport and storage, you would also need to add in the prerequisite program ISO 22002 Part 5 for transport and storage. So a certification scope that includes food manufacturing and transport and storage activities would require all 3 prerequisite programs. So remember, it's modular and it needs to cover the scope of your certification. Next slide. So it's probably easiest to explain how this modular program works by looking at the common requirements and then overlaying them with the additional requirements under each of the sector-specific requirements. So if we look at ISO 22002 Part 1 for food manufacturing, the purple boxes are the same as the common requirements we've just spoken about. The additional requirements are indicated in the pink boxes. So under the common requirements for construction and layout of buildings, under food manufacturing, there are additional requirements for drains and drainage requirements. Under utilities, there are additional requirements specified for water, ice, steam, and boiler chemicals. Additional requirements for management of purchased products, specifically around maintaining and management of access points to bulk material receiving lines. Under Clause 12 for measures for prevention of contamination, this is where we have a lot of the outcome and prescriptive requirements in this sector being introduced specific to food manufacturing around prevention of microbial contamination, allergen control, physical and chemical contamination. There's also additional requirements that have been added to cleaning and disinfection, particularly around CIP processes, clean in place processes, and there's a new clause, clause 17, that deals specifically with rework. Next slide. If you've joined us from the catering sector, your additional requirements are different to food manufacturing, and they fall under utilities, waste, food loss and waste management and recycling, equipment suitability and maintenance, management of purchased materials, specifically around contamination, preventing contamination of prepared food during receival. Your additional requirements under measures for prevention of contamination are specific to allergen control. There's also additional requirements around personal hygiene and employee facilities, representing the fact that a lot of catering operations are more manual based than they are automated. And your additional clauses are around preparation. So clause 17 is new, and it has very specific requirements around the use of suitable raw materials and handling of leftovers. And there is a very detailed annex in this PRP looking at typical types of controls that would be expected for a catering or food service operation. Next slide. If you have joined us and you are a food packaging manufacturer, your additional requirements, in addition to the common requirements, fall under management of purchased materials and measures for prevention of contamination, specifically chemical and physical contamination and migration, prevention of migration. Your additional clause is clause 17, and it covers rework usage, so rework of recycled packaging content. Next slide. If you've joined us and you have a scope for transport and storage, you don't have any additional prerequisite programs to the common requirements, with the exception that there is a new clause for transport and storage, clause 17, which looks at categorisation of product groups, controlled conditions, and excuse me, goods identification. Next slide. If you've joined us and you have feed and animal food production, your additional requirements fall under design and layout of facilities and workspace, under measures for prevention of contamination, specifically around avoiding cross-contamination with any medications that are added to medicated feeds, product and consumer information, so medications to be declared, and your extra clause is clause 17 for rework, specifically rework containing medication. And then the last of the additional prerequisite programs, next slide, is around for retail and wholesale. And you can see that your additional requirements to the common requirements fall under measures for prevention of contamination, rework usage, and there are two additional requirements. You have 17, clause 17 for rework usage, and clause 18 for the display of food. So it is a vast improvement that provides clarity on what are the common prerequisite programs to any organisation in the food supply chain, with specific and very appropriate PRPs defined for different food sectors. Now, one of the questions in the chat box was, where can I get a copy of them? The ISO standards are copyright, so you will need to purchase your own copy of the required prerequisite program, which at a minimum would be prerequisite program 22002 part 100 plus your food sector standard. Next slide. Okay, so on to poll 3. Can we have the question, please? So which topic would you like to dive deeper into Q&A? And live, I'm going to try and address some of this in the second half of my presentation. So please quickly put your votes in, and then we'll get into part 2, which is looking at the FSSC additional requirements. Okay, how are we going on that poll? Okay, well, that gives me good guidance. So PRP implementation guidance and audit expectations under version 7 at the top 2. So we're going to get straight into that now. Great. So next slide, please. Okay, let's look at some of the highlights of FSSC 22000. So Kelly did an excellent overview. I won't speak to all of those additional requirements. I've picked some of them that I think will be common to most of you on the webinar today. So if we look at management of services and purchase materials, we know that there is an additional requirement, an expansion, where microbiological, physical, chemical, and allergenic specifications used for food safety purposes need to be based on appropriate scientific principles where legislation is absent. So if it is not regulated in your country of production, you might need to look elsewhere to base some of your limits on scientifically validated information. This is to make sure that food safety remains robust and defensible even in unregulated or emerging areas. So I think the go-to for most businesses is going to be Codex guidelines. So always go to Codex guidelines first, have a look to see if they have a standard which would meet your requirements. And we've listed some here. Microbiological standards are also very well documented by the ICMSF data as they are in Codex. Allergens, there is an excellent document in Codex referred to as the Codex Risk Assessment of Food Allergens for allergen residue limits that are all supported by clinical threshold data. Chemical limits, if not regulated in your country, can also be found under the Codex guidance for maximum residue limits and risk management recommendations. And for physical and foreign matter hazards, these are generally not regulated or covered under legislation. There isn't a Codex guide. However, what I would recommend people to do is to work with your foreign object detection equipment providers to validate the equipment you have and to make sure that you are working to industry best practice for the detection of foreign matter and removal of contaminated food from the supply chain. Next slide. If we look at food defence and food fraud mitigation, you know that there's a new competency requirement for people that are doing the assessments and for the plans, either for food defence or for food fraud mitigation. One of the questions in the chat box was, what specific training do I need? There is no specified training. So some of the things that I would suggest you do is to look at targeted training. So is there an opportunity to go to some external training to upskill the people that have been nominated to do food defence or to do food fraud prevention? Also, document any contributions that you or your team members might make to food defence and food fraud mitigation team as evidence of your contribution. Also, engage in practical application of mitigation measures. This all creates objective evidence around competency. Competency isn't just training, it's not just knowledge, it's also about the skills to apply food defence mitigation measures and food fraud mitigation. Also, look at ongoing professional development and membership to relevant industry groups. It is really important that we have the right people doing the threat assessments and the vulnerability assessments, because if we don't have the right people doing that, we could miss something that is really important to our business to prevent malicious contamination or disruption to business by cybercrime or economically motivated adulteration from food fraud. So important that it's a different team to what we have looking at food safety. We need different expertise and specialist advice. Next slide. So food safety and quality culture, another question came in around how do we make sure that we've got sufficient resources? I want to emphasize here that resources are not just financial. Resources are financial and non-financial. So a couple of ideas here would be around visible leadership commitment, where leaders have allocated a budget and approved resources specifically for food safety and quality improvements. Another one is, do we have adequate staffing and competent people? So is there an investment to have enough people to complete food safety and quality tasks? Do they receive training, refresher training, and coaching where needed? Do we have effective time and workload management? So do we have enough time to perform essential tasks for food safety like cleaning and monitoring? Do we have realistic production schedules and targets that don't compromise our food safety rules? And what sort of financial resourcing is provided to maintain not only training and people competency, but also to upgrade equipment and to improve infrastructure and building fabric where it's needed so that it doesn't become a contamination? Next slide. If we look at food safety and quality culture, the other additional requirement is a demonstrable commitment from all personnel to the production and safe handling of food. So this is more than everybody signing a policy that says, I commit to a positive food safety and quality culture. So some of the ideas on the way that you could demonstrate your commitment would be integrating food safety and quality expectations into roles and daily practices. It would be building on training and competency so people know what they have to do and why they have to do it. Also, rewarding positive behaviour, acknowledging food safety and quality champions, taking into account employee feedback. Near-miss incident reporting is also a really powerful way to get engagement and to show people that are on the front line that you are responsive to their feedback. And also look at what sort of performance measurement and monitoring, such as KPIs or cultural metrics, could you introduce that can be measured and reported back into management review. A strong food safety and quality culture shows in consistent behaviours across all shifts and departments. So auditors will assess both what your documentation says you do, but also your practices through observations and conversations they have with people during the audit. Next slide. Product design and development. As Kelly mentioned, there's a new requirement around design and development of primary packaging for you to consider safe food packaging design principles. So what do these look like? Look, there's so much we could say about this and we have such limited time, but the 5 principles are here. It's around designing to contain and protect product, designing to preserve, enhance product appeal and extend its shelf life, designing to provide convenience and avoid food waste in handling, designing to promote and communicate to consumers how to handle, store, prepare and reuse the food to minimize waste, and designing to meet and balance food waste and sustainable packaging targets. So what does this look like? And on the right hand side of this slide, you can see things that would meet this criteria would be implementing and building in resealable features to packaging. So for pouches that will preserve freshness and extend shelf life. It could be through portion control or variety pack sizes, so people only open what they're going to consume. Could be improved protection and containment of delicate product through the supply chain, and the examples they're given are around delicate fresh produce and berries. It could be through improved design of pouches that not only are easy to open, but allow you to remove as much as the product from that packaging as possible so that you don't have retained product. It could also be through integrating smart or active packaging design so that you can check that the product has been stored under the right conditions to maximize shelf life. And the other one, and I think this is probably the easiest to do, is to give some clear communication to your consumers and on-pack guidance on how can they extend the shelf life of the product. What can they do? Can they freeze remaining portions? How can they use the leftovers? Maybe even a QR code to recipe ideas on what to do with leftover product. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So in terms of content, food loss and waste, I'm very passionate about this because every place I have ever been to, I have never not found food loss and waste. So really important that we look at supporting our food loss and waste objectives by clear and measurable targets with defined timelines. I've put a few examples here for you to consider. So, and I'm just going to pick one. We're short of time, but I really like example number 3, decrease inventory storage by 20% by June 2027 through improved forecasting. So something like this would give you a clear, measurable target with a defined timeline. All of these examples are things that businesses can do. Next slide. So getting ready for your version 7 upgrade audit, just a couple of highlights here. You will need to obtain a copy of the prerequisite program standards that are relevant to your business, please download them from the ISO or BSI Knowledge website. There is a fee to pay for those. You can download the FSSC's 22,000 scheme documentation for free from their website. Once you have the criteria, think about the intent. Why have they introduced this? Why do I need to do this? It will help you in the application. Revise your internal audit checklists and conduct audits to identify the gaps in your food safety management system. Align any sustainability commitments with your SDGs and with the FSSC additional requirements and add these to your food safety management system. Assign owners to the gaps and create an action plan. Update your documentation and make sure that any changes to the documented system are reflected in actual practice. Auditors are going to look for this. And train and build competence in your team and provide refresher training when needed. Last slide, please. Okay, so just to wrap up our presentation, how do you get ready? I would encourage you all to have a risk-based focus. Prioritise based on your product and process risk and your past audit performance. Look at where do you need to focus your attention first and where is going to need most of your time and effort to upgrade. Have a look at timeline alignment. Make sure that you transition before your upgrade audit. And I think the big takeaway is take this opportunity to enhance the overall effectiveness of your food safety management system, not just a quick compliance update to get through version 7. It is a great opportunity to enhance what you already do. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to go to our questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leanne and Kelly. It was very, very insightful presentations, and we have a lot of questions. Guess we can get right to it. I combine a few questions. First, I will go over to Kelly. So there are a question on about the changes, or if there is any changes or update on the FSSC guidance documents. And then there is also another question on whether all the additional requirements only apply to specific organization, or there is any like common requirements which apply to all the sector. And also how the upgrade audit is going to look like for this FSSC version 7.
Thank you. I will try to remember all of those. But to start off with the guidance documents, so the ones that already exist can still be utilized now by organizations, even in preparation for version 7. However, we will be updating them, so they will all be revised, and this will be taking place during Q4 of this year, so end of this year, the last quarter, October to December, looking for publication early at the beginning of next year. So at least a full quarter before the version 7 audits become auditable. And we will be taking a lot of information into account, like, for instance, the new PAS 96 that Leanne was the technical author of, the new food safety culture paper that was published by GFSI. So there will be updated information in those guidance documents. But just as a reminder to organizations, they're not mandatory for use. They are only guidance, but it does contain a wealth of information. Then on to the additional requirements. So if you have a look in part 2 of the scheme, you will see that next to each additional requirement, for instance, 2.5.1, it'll indicate to you whether it's applicable to all food chain categories or whether it's applicable to specific ones. So for your organization, if you're not aware of what your food chain category is, then we recommend you just go and have a look at your certificate, because it would indicate what it is. If you're not certified, you can go to table 1 in part 1 of the scheme and see what category applies to your organization. And then when you look at those additional requirements, you can see specifically which ones do you need to consider and which ones aren't applicable to your specific sector. And then your last question is about the upgrade audits. So as mentioned, I think Leanne took us through in one of the later slides, and I think that question came through before then. She took you through really good examples of how can you prepare for your upgrade audits, and what do you need to do. what gap assessments do you need to do? How do you need to incorporate things into your system? So I think a lot of that was answered already. But from the actual audit itself, so it won't be a standalone upgrade audit. It will be part of the next audit that is due in your cycle during that transition timeframe. So if you are due for a recertification audit between the 1st of May 2027 and the 30th of April 2028, then your upgrade audit will take place at that recertification audit. And then you will be audited against the full version 7 requirements. I hope I've answered all of them.
Yeah, thank you. And
Sure.
I know Leanne has a specific interest on food loss and waste. So there are a couple of questions around that one. So for the clause related food loss and waste, should we document it, and on what form should organization document this? Also for how they measure the target on food waste for food chemicals specifically.
Okay, thank you, TT. So, look, the first one is FSSC isn't prescriptive as to how you need to document this. So, in terms of documenting objectives with measurable and time-bound targets, you would do this the same way that you do for your food safety objectives. So, I would recommend you create you need to have a policy around reducing food loss and waste, and then supporting that policy would be your objectives on what you want to achieve in reducing food waste, and then what your targets would be. Now, I think sometimes people think that they need to do a baseline measurement. We can't do this until we know how much waste we have. It's always helpful to know what your baseline is, because then you can apply a percentage reduction or a volume reduction. However, please don't let that be something that stops you as an obstacle from starting to reduce food waste. It could even be that you estimate the amount of food waste you have through some crude measurement of product in, product out, and then you start honing in and measuring food waste. And the more you measure, the more accurate that will be. But you don't have to know your baseline to start reducing waste.
Thank you, Leanne. And we have a question, I guess, Kelly, you can answer this one, is on the scope of certification, whether it's include transportation, one case, facility only transport their product, whether the ISO 22002-5 required or not.
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, I would imagine that it's a manufacturer that's manufacturing their own products, and they also transport their own products. In that case, it would just be Part 100 and Part 1 that would apply. If they start also transporting and acting as a transport provider or storage provider for other organizations as well, then they will need to also apply Part 5 as well.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. And Leanne, this is a question for you. Could you expand on what type of evidence will be required to demonstrate food defense competence? Yeah, you mentioned example earlier already, right? So yeah, they need
Sure.
example.
Look, I think it's a good question. Thank you, Irina, for this one. I know that there are a numerous number of courses that will be available looking at food defence, and especially around the new PAS 96. Look, I would encourage somebody, if you're able to go on a course or a webinar about this. We're offering a BSI webinar on the updates to PAS 96. I believe that's on the 14th of July. Because it's important to understand, I guess, the detail around malicious contamination versus disruption to business to cybercrime versus economically motivated adulteration. So there's we've got an evolving threat environment, and we have a range of mitigation measures. And I think the most important thing is to make sure that people feel confident to do these assessments and that they change their food defence plan as things evolve within their own business as well. So there are certainly external courses to attend. There are webinars that you can attend for free, and it's also undertaking some self-learning. And for some of you, you might have the opportunity to join professional memberships where there is a consultative group within food manufacturing that talk about non-competitive ways of upskilling everybody on food defence.
Thank you. There's an interesting question here about the next audit. So if the next audit cycle is unannounced audit, so will the upgrade be announced as well, or it's going to be moved to the next following year? I don't know who would answer this question. Kelly, would you answer the question?
Just to make sure I'm understanding, it's with regards to an unannounced audit?
Yeah, so if the next audit cycle is unannounced audit, and then they have to also do upgrade on first and second.
Yes, so if same as for version 6, if the audit that is due at the time of upgrade is an unannounced audit, then the version 7 upgrade will be an unannounced audit, correct?
Okay, thank you. And also, we have a question: how do audits evaluate sufficient resources? Is there any expectation for objective evidence, such as staffing level or time availability, training, etc.? Is it possible that insufficient manpower and unrealistic workload for food safety professional be considered evidence? So yeah, it's around resources.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, and I feel it's my turn because Kelly answered the previous one. Look, I think it is a point. We really need to do a case-by-case assessment, and you need to look at as an auditor, speaking as an auditor, you look at the impact of the resource constraints on the food safety outcome. So many food organisations are going to be have constrained resources. That's the nature of doing business. But what is most important is what is the impact of that resource constraint, and does it result in a poor food safety outcome? That is when the auditor is going to dig deeper and looking at if the resource issue is something that would be raised as a non-conformance within the context of the expectation around sufficient resource allocation.
Thank you, Leanne. And this is a question for Kelly. Regarding FSSC additional requirement for 2.513 on organization design primary packaging, does it applicable to food manufacturer?
Yes, so if the food manufacturer is involved in the design of the packaging material, then it's also applicable to them. So it's not only applicable to category I organizations. Anybody that undertakes design of the packaging material, it would apply to.
Also, does ISO 22002-5 will apply even though it's like internal, even though it's for internal storage tank, for example?
Yeah. I think we need to understand the question a little bit better. If it is a food manufacturer and they only store their own materials within their site, then no, Part 5 wouldn't apply. But we do also have specific requirements on tank storage as well within the additional requirements. So that would need to be considered.
Thank you. Now I think we can go over to some culture questions. So how can organization effectively implement the culture with employees from different countries? So yeah, please share your comment, maybe Leanne.
I was really busy typing answers in the chat box. Sorry, Titi. What was the question again?
So it's about the, I guess, food safety culture. So how can we effectively implement in our organization with employees from different countries and culture? So yeah, please share your comments, how to implement the food safety culture.
I think it really comes back to the intent of food safety and quality culture right back in version 6, and it was always implied in ISO 22000 prior to that, around how do you create a positive and proactive food safety culture. And I like to simplify it to say, how do we know that people will do the right thing when nobody is looking? So how do we empower people with the knowledge on why it's important in what they do? What supervision do we provide to make sure that we are having a positive difference? And how can we show that we continue to move the maturity of our organisation beyond compliance? And I think, I guess my takeaway for this is I've seen businesses evolve from having an over-reliance on controls where people are required to follow the procedure, and moving that to a higher level of hierarchy of control where they engineer out the problems. So they think about the issues they're having with compliance and they move it from please follow the procedure, which of course we all know can be somewhat problematic, to how can we build in controls so that you cannot do the wrong thing in terms of a food safety issue here, because we've actually designed that out of the process or we've replaced it with equipment.
Thank you. So I guess this also will answer, I think, the last question here. Would there be or I don't know, maybe you can add a little bit more comment on this question. Would there be general culture survey checklist or has it to be designed based on specific demographics?
I think you can use as one tool in your toolkit to improve food safety and quality culture. Questionnaires can be useful for organisations to identify where they need to focus their resources and help them identify perhaps a difference between what they perceive the culture to be and perhaps what people employed by the business perceive the culture to be. But they are just one means of improving food safety culture. So it needs a multi-pronged effort. And I would say surveys with training, with coaching and mentoring, with a food safety quality champion, also supported by near-miss reporting and an acknowledgement or a reward program to nurture positive food safety and quality culture behaviours.
We still have a lot of questions and we already over time here. Maybe we answer one more question and then the rest of the question we will answer after the webinar. So we will list all the questions and then we will ask the speakers to answer every single question, and then we will, send the answers to whoever sent the questions to us. So last question here: for a catering organization that produces its own pastries and has a logistic chain for deliveries, will the multi-site certification cover the whole organization? Yeah, anyone wants to answer? Maybe Kelly?
To be honest, I think we need to have a look at that one in a little bit more detail in order to be able to give an informed response to them, because you're talking about pastry production and the distribution of it. Now, is that catering or is that actually a manufacturing with the distribution attached to it? So I think that one we might need to gather a little bit more information from the organization to make sure we give an accurate response.
You want to add, Leanne? I thought you want to speak something.
I was just going to say that these questions that are very specific to your particular organisation, Kelly and I won't be able to answer those. So we encourage you to go back to your certification body and to question with them, your auditor, or back to your account manager, just to say, I'm having some, so I've got some questions around the scope of my certification. Can you help clarify that for me? So there will be some questions, unfortunately, that we're not able to give a response to because it's very much on a case-by-case basis. Thank you.
Thank you. That was our last question because we're already 10 minutes over time. So thank you once again, Kelly and Leanne, for sharing our expertise with us today and for very engaging discussion. We have so many questions, and thank you also to all participants for joining and also for active participation. So yeah, please, before you leave, complete this feedback poll. It will be really appreciated for us to improve in our next event. So yeah, thank you so much once more time. Have a great day, everyone, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.